pursuing happiness. You're doing all right. When... The other guy's around and he means business, so get going. Remember, you're off base. You've just got time to save yourself. Drop whatever you're doing. Find the nearest hole and make like a mole. Pick a room in a good building, close to the ground. It ought to be airtight and light-proof as possible, with the doors shut, windows closed.
It's a bomb. Duck and cover. Duck and cover. Duck and cover. That's the first thing to do.
If you saw it advancing on you a mile away, you'd have about 30 seconds to take cover. Make for the nearest entrance, but be orderly about it.
If you are at home when a surprise attack occurs, crawl beneath a table if it is very near, or drop to the floor with your back to the window.
That fog has contaminated everything it touched with radioactive matter, which we'll call hot stuff. Although it hasn't anything to do with its temperature.
After many generations lived under the fear of a nuclear war, it took only a few images from New York on September 11 to awaken in the American population some familiar ghosts, and to bring psychologically to its knees a nation that had never experienced an attack on its territory before. Confused between the fear of an unknown enemy and an ill-repressed thirst for revenge, Americans flatly accepted a war, the invasion of Afghanistan, that had already been planned to the smallest detail.
Our grief has turned to anger, and anger to resolution. Whether we bring our enemies to justice or bring justice to our enemies, justice will be done.
Who really wanted the New York and Washington attacks? Who was truly responsible? The United States immediately accused Osama bin Laden, although they never produced the evidence they claimed to have against him. Nor did anyone express any particular surprise about the lack of a true motive on the part of bin Laden himself. It was as if the entire world was ready to accept that he was the evildoer just by someone pointing the finger at him. Everyone seems satisfied with the idea that bin Laden allegedly hated our civilization. This, however, is clearly at odds with the fact that he has never actually claimed responsibility for the attacks. The first thing every terrorist in the world has ever been concerned with was to put forward some kind of statement clearly explaining the reasons behind their act. Bin Laden, instead, a few days after the attacks, clearly stated that he had nothing to do with them at all. Only 3 months later would the CIA find a home video in Afghanistan in which bin Laden implies to have had pre-knowledge of the events while talking to a Saudi friend. The images, however, are so poor the video ended up posing more questions than it ever answered. To a closer examination, the man's features only resemble those of bin Laden. but the identity of the person can be anything but certain. In any case, a talk with a friend on a questionable videotape is not an official claim. The world is filled with psychopaths who accuse themselves of crimes they never committed, but without a good motive, they seldom even manage to get arrested. In 2006, the FBI stated that they never had any hard evidence against bin Laden, which contradicted the initial claims by the administration. The Bureau's website lists bin Laden as wanted for the bombings of the American embassies in Kenya and Tanzania, but he is only suspected of other terrorist activities in the world. Officially, Osama bin Laden has never been wanted for the September 11 attacks.
It's a new age of wickedness.
Popular journalist and radio host Alex Jones, who has been pointing the finger at the U.S. administration since the beginning, had foreseen the attacks 1 month before they took place, and exactly by the hand of bin Laden. This recording is from July 25, 2001.
And I want you to let them know that if there is any terrorism, we know who to blame. If any terrorism comes, it's from this government. And if there was an outside threat like a bin Laden who was a known CIA asset in the 80s, he's the boogeyman they need.
19 hijackers of the planes had crashed into the World Trade Center towers, into the Pentagon, and into the rural area in Pennsylvania.
Seen from up close, the official version soon started to show some serious weaknesses. Too many curious events, too many inconsistencies, too many coincidences pointed at the possibility that the truth had been somewhat different from what we had been told. This set off an unprecedented investigation on the internet. Thousands of independent researchers from all over the world ended up bringing to light so many faults in the official version that it legitimized suspicion that the U.S. administration had some kind of role in the attacks. From flight amateurs who perform highly acrobatic maneuvers without ever having piloted a jet in their life, to passports, personal wills, and terrorists' bandanas conveniently emerging from a hole where the plane cannot be found. From an entire Boeing 757 disappearing in a 15-foot wide hole, to modern steel buildings collapsing against the most fundamental laws of physics. It has become very difficult today to maintain that the official version reflects what truly happened on that day. In fact, in 2006, almost half of Americans believed that the Bush administration covered up the truth about 9/11. And the protests of those requesting a new, truly independent investigation keep increasing by the day. The more evidence that is gathered towards an inside job, however, the more it seems that it was not the work of the American government, but of a small group of people, the so-called neocons, or neoconservatives, who came to power with the election of George W. Bush in the year 2000.
I, George Walker Bush, do solemnly swear that I will faithfully...
These are some of the founders of the so-called PNAC, or Project for the New American Century. Dick Cheney, Donald Rumsfeld, Paul Wolfowitz, Richard Perle, whose political alliance dates back some 30 years ago.
In my opinion, treason. The cabal of neoconservatives at PNAC, I think you all know what that is, who planned this war, Cheney, Rumsfeld, Wolfowitz, Libby, Perle. This cabal knew the American people would not stand for a war against Iraq unless there was, as they put it in their own document, a new Pearl Harbor. 9/11 supplied that.
According to this theory, President Bush was not part of the original project, which coincidentally happened when he was out of town.
About tax cuts. You can talk about it at the next event.
Different elements seem to support this theory.
Emma Booker Elementary School.
First of all, the fact that the Secret Service, who are in charge of the president's safety, allowed Bush to remain in the school for over half an hour after the second tower in New York had been hit.
The second plane is in the second tower.
At that point, the president had clearly become a possible target, and the duty of the Secret Service was to remove him immediately from a place where everybody knew he was at the time.
He was made aware that the first jetliner was struck.
However, no one seems to have worried about his safety, nor about the children at the school, or the school's personnel around him. It was as if someone within the Secret Service knew that the school was not going to be a target.
May God bless the victims, their families.
Furthermore, when Bush tried to get back to Washington, the White House gave warning that Air Force One was the next target, forcing the pilot of the presidential plane to a hurried, spectacular takeoff.
This is Air Force One departing Sarasota, Florida.
Yes, it's 9:07.
The journalists traveling with the president later commented, "It was like a rocket. For a good 10 minutes, it kept climbing almost vertically."
This is Ann Compton with a pool report. I am with the president.
As Bush was frantically trying to communicate with Dick Cheney, the lines with the White House kept cutting off. Frustrated, the president pounded on his desk, shouting, "This is inexcusable. Get me the vice president." After a stop in Louisiana, Air Force One landed in a military base in Nebraska. From here, the president and his staff were transferred to an underground bunker, where they remained locked up for the rest of the afternoon. After these multiple detours, President Bush was able to return to Washington only in the evening, when all the major decisions had already been made. It was later found that the threats to Air Force One never existed. Thus begins to form a picture of a president unaware of the facts, and somehow held hostage by the neocons who were effectively in charge throughout the whole day. At the White House was Vice President Cheney. At the Pentagon, Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld, and next to him his deputy, Paul Wolfowitz.
It is a shell game.
This is what Michael Ledeen, one of the most influential neoconservatives, had to say about the presidency of George W. Bush.
All right, so he became president, but he didn't know why. And on September 11th, he discovered why.
Our war on terror begins with Al-Qaeda, but it does not end there. It will not end until every terrorist group of global reach has been found, stopped, and defeated. I have a message for our military. Be ready.
But who are the neocons? The neoconservative school of thought can be traced to the University of Chicago's Professor Leo Strauss, who began enunciating its principles by the end of the 60s.
It's sort of a happy happening for hippies.
It was the time of the flower children, of the civil rights battles, of sexual liberation and individual freedom, which had reached levels never imagined before. All of this, however, for Strauss, represented only the seed of a rapid and disastrous decadence for the entire American nation. According to his thinking, individual freedom leads to personal conflicts, which undermine the nation's potential for growth and success. What Strauss envisioned was a compact, uniform society held together by a universal glue that would allow each individual to pour their personal ambitions into a collective movement, all directed toward the outside. But the only way to obtain this was to face the population with a large, dark enemy, whose existence would threaten the survival of the American nation. Among Strauss's most enthusiastic followers was a young Paul Wolfowitz. The idea of creating an evil enemy to bring together a whole nation was certainly not new. From Nero to Hitler, history is filled with examples in which this strategy was used with great success. The novelty introduced by the neocons, however, was that for the first time in history, the adversary would be the entire world. The main obstacle for the neocons was represented by Henry Kissinger, Nixon's Secretary of State, who pursued with foreign countries a policy of détente, based on solid bilateral agreements. But when Nixon was forced to resign due to the Watergate scandal, the neocons were able to place next to the new president, Gerald Ford, a Secretary of Defense who would find himself in the same position some 30 years later, Donald Rumsfeld. Another neocon who was able to take advantage of the situation was Dick Cheney, who became Chief of Staff for the new president. Thus, the White House started to become a familiar territory for these men, who envisioned a strong America that imposed its rule to the rest of the world and led the other nations in the eternal fight of good versus evil. In spite of some relatively quiet times with Russia, it was in fact Donald Rumsfeld who kept trying to enlarge the appearance of an enemy that history itself would later reveal as totally non-existent.
The Soviet Union has been busy. They've been busy in terms of their level of effort. They've been busy in terms of the actual weapons that they've been producing. They've been busy in terms of expanding production rates. They've been busy in terms of expanding their institutional capability to produce additional weapons at additional rates. They've been busy in terms of expanding their capability to increasingly improve the sophistication of those weapons. Year after year after year, they've been demonstrating that they have steadiness of purpose, that they're purposeful about what they're doing.
Since none of this, however, was reflected by the current intelligence, Rumsfeld managed to convince President Ford to create an independent group to re-examine all the information that the CIA had gathered about the Russians from the beginning. The group was called Team B, and it was put under the direction of the neoconservative Richard Pipes, who took under his wing a young and enthusiastic Paul Wolfowitz. Team B's true purpose was to manipulate the CIA's original intelligence with the intent of presenting the Soviet Union as a truly evil nation, equipped with the most powerful secret technology, whose only intent was to annihilate the United States. Naturally, by the end of their task, Pipes and Wolfowitz presented a report containing a truly terrifying image of the Soviet Empire. It was, however, a false image, born of the projection of their own need for a powerful enemy towards which to direct the precious energies of the nation that were being absorbed by a moral relativism that they deemed unacceptable. The new Carter presidency imposed a temporary setback in their path to world domination. The need to quickly reconquer the White House led the neocons to seek an alliance in a totally uncharted territory, the religious one, which accounted for a large amount of potential new votes. Traditionally, the leaders of the different Protestant denominations had kept their flocks away from politics, a world they considered immoral and corrupt. But the fear of falling under communist rule, which would have also brought atheism along, was apparently sufficient to provide the basis for a historic alliance that has lasted ever since.
I'm sick and tired of hearing about all of the radicals and the perverts and the liberals and the leftists and the communists coming out of the closets. It's time for God's people to come out of the closets, out of the churches, and change America. We must do it.
Ronald Reagan won the 1980 election by a landslide. And at that point, the neocons felt they had the right to claim some important positions in the new administration. Paul Wolfowitz became the head of external relations for the White House, while a friend of his from the times of Strauss, Richard Pearl, was appointed Deputy Secretary of Defense. But the great enemy they were seeking was in the meantime collapsing under the weight of internal divisions and corruption. The last attempt by the Soviets to expand their influence was the invasion of Afghanistan in 1980. It was then that the CIA engaged Osama bin Laden and his freedom fighters, providing them with all the logistical, military, and strategic support to push the Soviets back to their borders. With the departure of the Russians from Kabul, the process of disintegration that would lead to the fall of the Berlin Wall had well begun. Before the collapse of the traditional enemy made of chicken wire, the neocons began to entertain the notion of extending their military and strategic control to the entire world.
We want to change some deeply entrenched notions about the proper role of American power in the world.
But controlling the world over the last century has always meant to control the supply of energy, which means to control the oil and gas resources in the Middle East. This is not a new concept at all.
The British checkmated Hitler in Syria when they moved in before the Nazis could take over, thus cutting off a potential source of oil for the German panzer divisions. Iran, too, is the same story. The British, with this coup, control almost all of the Middle East oil supply. This is the oil that Hitler badly needed, but lost. And with Russia in the way, he can't win the Caucasian oil fields.
The golden opportunity came with the first Gulf War in 1991. At the crucial moment, however, with the Iraqi troops in total disarray, President Bush decided to stop the push and leave Saddam Hussein at the head of the nation. The ambitions of global control of the neocons suffered another temporary setback, which turned into a never-ending nightmare with the unexpected victory of Bill Clinton in the 1992 elections. Meanwhile, Russia was pulling itself up again, and the neocons could see the opportunity of world domination slip away year after year.
Ever since the Cold War ended, there were people who were fuming on the right, thinking, this is the golden opportunity, now that Russia's out of the way, for America to take over the world. We're not doing anything about it. Those damn liberals, those soft heads, are keeping us from doing what is our godly mission.
As they sat waiting for the end of Clinton's mandate, the neocons put together the so-called Wolfowitz Doctrine, which established the right of the United States to engage in preemptive war anywhere in the world, in order to avoid other nations from challenging their supremacy. Thus was born a precise strategic plan of global reach, which we have come to know as the PNAC, or Project for the New American Century. After the return to the White House, with the controversial election won by George Bush in the year 2000, the neocons needed to rehash the operation left uncompleted by the father 10 years before. We now find Dick Cheney as Vice President, Donald Rumsfeld as Secretary of Defense, and as his deputy, Paul Wolfowitz. In order to restart the gigantic war machine, however, it would not be sufficient to awaken the Soviet ghosts, which in the meantime had been relegated to the pages of history. A different kind of enemy was needed. It had to be everywhere and nowhere, elusive but ever present, in order to inject in the American population enough fear for them to support a military response of global reach.
يا خيل الله اركبي فاختاروا الخندق الذي تكونون فيه.
With a few touch-ups, Al-Qaeda, which was the name of the database with all the names of the people the CIA had sent to fight with bin Laden, became the name of the most powerful terrorist organization in the world. Bin Laden saw himself accused of the bombings of the American embassies in Kenya and Tanzania and of the American ship Cole, without having claimed responsibility for them. The suspicion that someone within the CIA and FBI was building an artificial figure to be used in false flag terrorist operations seems to be confirmed by internal conflicts that have reached as high as the presidency itself.
After the cold, I had battle plans drawn to go into Afghanistan, overthrow the Taliban, and launch a full-scale attack search for bin Laden. But we needed basing rights in Uzbekistan, which we got after 9/11. The CIA and the FBI refused to certify that bin Laden was responsible while I was there. No one knew Al-Qaeda existed then.
The Western media, however, had already made up their minds. Bin Laden was the bad guy, and from him anything could be expected at that point. On the eve of September 10, 2001, a full plan to attack Afghanistan with strong support to the Northern Alliance was placed on Bush's table to be signed by the president upon his return from Florida. All that was needed was a detonator to set in motion the operation that would have finally brought America to the strategic control of worldwide resources and the neocons to the realization of their dream. Let's take a step back and read some paragraphs from the final PNAC document, which was published in September of the year 2000. In the chapter called Creating Tomorrow's Dominant Force, we can read, "At present, the United States faces no global rival. America's grand strategy should aim to preserve and extend this advantageous position as far into the future as possible. The United States must retain sufficient forces able to rapidly deploy and win multiple simultaneous large-scale wars. The United States must reposition U.S. forces to respond to 21st century strategic realities by shifting permanently based forces to Southeast Europe and Southeast Asia. The Army's annual budget must increase to the $90 to $95 billion level. Specialized Air Force aircraft, like the J-Stars above, are too few in numbers to meet current mission demand. The Army should accelerate its plans to purchase medium-weight vehicles. The transformation effort must be considered as pressing a military mission as preparing for today's theater wars. Further, the process of transformation, even if it brings a revolutionary change, is likely to be a long one, absent some catastrophic and catalyzing event, like a new Pearl Harbor.
Jap planes without warning bring war to America. Our great Pacific outpost in the Hawaiian Islands is ruthlessly bombed as Japan's perfidious declaration of war. Death and destruction unleashed on a nation at peace. On that fateful Sunday morning when this country was extending a friendly hand of conciliation and peace. The treacherous attacks brought death to almost 3,000 American soldiers, sailors, and civilians. Our loss in warships and planes was high, but overnight this nation was united in an all-out determination to avenge the hideous assault on American lives and property. Our battle cry is, remember Pearl Harbor.
Dense black smoke billowed to the sky as the massive control tower began to keel over. The Arizona's courageous crew stuck to its guns until the very end. Here was displayed heroism that will live forever in the glorious annals and traditions of the American Navy.
September 11 was not the first time America was drawn into a war by an ambiguous incident. The American Constitution doesn't allow the United States to wage a preemptive war, and reserves for Congress the power of declaring war to another nation. For this reason, every time a president has wanted to enter a war or to begin a new one, he has had to wait for a military incident, whether created or provoked, to justify the use of force in front of Congress and the American people. In 1898, the United States went to war against Spain in order to take control of the Caribbean area. The pretext came from the sinking of the USS Maine, which was anchored near the Cuban island. The Spanish were immediately accused of the attack, even though they sternly denied any involvement in it. The images of the sunken vessel and those of the sailors' funerals were shown in the first movie theaters of the nation, thus generating a strong wave of indignation that allowed Theodore Roosevelt, then Secretary of the Navy, to start a war he had already prepared to the smallest detail. Only in 1980, almost a century later, would America recognize that the Spanish were not responsible for the attack. In order not to accuse themselves, however, the United States declared that the Maine was sunk because some explosives had been stacked too close to the steam room. In the meantime, the entire Spanish Armada had been wiped out, and America had become the new maritime power, with strategic positions going from the Caribbean to the Philippine Islands. In 1915, it was the sinking of the USS Lusitania by a German submarine to trigger the crisis that would eventually bring the United States into the First World War. It appears, however, that the U.S. had secretly slipped to the Germans the information that the ship was carrying a special cargo of weapons headed to England. This provoked a reaction from the German submarine, which sunk the vessel on which more than 100 Americans were also traveling. In 1941, it was the infamous Pearl Harbor attack to generate a wave of indignation large enough for President Roosevelt to declare war on Japan.
The facts of yesterday and today speak for themselves. With confidence in our armed forces, with the unbounding determination of our people, we will gain the inevitable triumph, so help us God.
Almost 3,000 sailors died in the surprise attack. History would later reveal that the administration knew of the attack in advance, but it did everything possible to delay the transfer of information to the Hawaiian port. This was confirmed by Admiral Kimmel, the port's commander who helplessly witnessed the massacre of his crews and the destruction of his vessels.
We needed one thing, which our own resources could not make available to us. That vital need was the information available in Washington from the intercepted dispatches, which told when and where Japan would probably strike. I did not get this information.
In 1964, the United States decided to officially declare war on North Vietnam. The war pretext came from the so-called Tonkin Gulf incident, in which North Vietnamese boats were accused of having launched torpedoes against the American destroyer Maddox. Then Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara immediately announced to the press the upcoming military action.
Immediately following the attack, U.S. representatives in Saigon met with representatives of the South Vietnamese government. They jointly agreed that joint retaliatory action was required. The President's approval of this action.
But McNamara, 40 years later, would openly confess that the attack on the Maddox never took place.
It was just confusion. And events afterwards showed that our judgment that we'd been attacked that day was wrong. It didn't happen.
In the meantime, more than 60,000 U.S. soldiers and over 3 million Vietnamese civilians lost their lives. In 1990, the situation between the United States and Iraq had grown tense, and the group of neoconservatives around President Bush convinced him it was time to attack Saddam Hussein. The U.S. secretly informed Saddam that they had nothing against him taking over the oil fields of Kuwait, a territory the Iraqi dictator had always claimed as his own. Saddam took the bait, and Iraq invaded Kuwait.
Tonight, the first pictures of the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait.
At that point, Dick Cheney, who was then Secretary of Defense, gave Saudi Arabia some satellite photos in which 250,000 Iraqi soldiers could be seen amassing behind the Kuwaiti border. Fearing an invasion, the Saudis granted the U.S. the extraordinary permission to establish military bases on the territory. At the same time, the worldwide media launched a heavy campaign against Saddam, who was accused of having used lethal gas against his own people. No mention was made to the fact that the gas had been sold to Saddam by the United States, which then stood silent during the massacre, even though they were perfectly aware of it. The media campaign against the Iraqi dictator reached its peak with this touching testimony from a young Kuwaiti nurse who described to the world the atrocities committed by the Iraqi soldiers in her invaded country.
While I was there, I saw the Iraqi soldiers come into the hospital with guns. They took the babies out of the incubators, took the incubators, and left the children to die on the cold floor.
The news shocked the entire world, and from that moment no one had a word to say about the American bombing of Iraq. Ten years later, some journalists stumbled onto a set of satellite photographs taken by the Russians over the same desert in the same days.
It's what it didn't show that was more important. What you would have expected to have seen were tanks on the border. There were none that could be seen. There was nothing behind the border that could have supported that kind of number of troops and tanks.
The same pictures that showed the Iraqi tanks in Kuwait City also showed that there was absolutely nothing behind the Saudi border. Not a tank, not a vehicle, not a single man. At the same time, the nurse who had brought to tears the entire world turned out to be the daughter of the Kuwaiti ambassador in Washington. She had faked the entire incubator story after having been professionally trained by one of the most important advertising agencies in Washington, Hill and Knowlton. In the meantime, the U.S. had wiped out the entire Iraqi army and had managed to establish permanent military bases in Saudi Arabia. In a cruel and ruthless shooting spree, and against all international treaties, the U.S. Air Forces literally destroyed and turned to ashes thousands of Iraqi soldiers on their way back to Baghdad. Before taking this picture, the photographer wrote on the side of the tank, "If I don't photograph this, people like my mom will think that war is what they see on TV." Besides the historic cases, there are also many plans of deception that, for one reason or another, were never used in the real world. One of them is called Operation Northwoods, a 1962 CIA secret plan that was declassified a few years ago. At that time, the United States was trying to regain control of Cuba, which had been lost to Fidel Castro's revolution 3 years before. Under the subject Justifications for a Military Intervention in Cuba, we can read the following proposals. We could blow up a U.S. ship in Guantanamo Bay and blame Cuba. We could blow up a drone, unmanned vessel anywhere in the Cuban waters. We could arrange to cause such incident in the vicinity of Havana or Santiago as a spectacular result of a Cuban attack from the air or sea or both. The U.S. could follow up with an air-sea rescue operation covered by U.S. fighters to evacuate remaining members of the non-existent crew. Casualties lists in U.S. newspapers would cause a helpful wave of national indignation. We could develop a communist Cuban terror campaign in the Miami area, in other Florida cities, and even Washington. We could sink a boatload of Cubans en route to Florida, real or simulated. We could foster attempts on lives of Cuban refugees even to the extent of wounding, in instances to be widely publicized. Hijacking attempts against civil air and surface craft should appear to continue as harassing measures condoned by the government of Cuba. And then there was this interesting idea. It is possible to create an incident which will demonstrate convincingly that a Cuban aircraft has attacked and shot down a chartered civil airliner en route from the United States to Jamaica, Guatemala, Panama, or Venezuela. An aircraft at Eglin Air Force Base would be painted and numbered as an exact duplicate for a civil registered aircraft belonging to a CIA proprietary organization in the Miami area. At a designated time, that duplicate will be substituted for the actual civil aircraft and would be loaded with the selected passengers, all boarded under carefully prepared aliases. The actual registered aircraft would be converted to a drone. Takeoff times of the drone aircraft and the actual aircraft would be scheduled to allow a rendezvous south of Florida. From the rendezvous point, the passenger-carrying aircraft will descend to minimum altitude and go directly into an auxiliary field at Eglin Air Force Base, where arrangements will have been made to evacuate the passengers and return the aircraft to its original status. What happens to those passengers is not clear. The drone aircraft, meanwhile, will continue to fly the filed flight plan. When over Cuba, the drone would be transmitting on the international distress frequency a Mayday message stating it is under attack by Cuban MiG aircraft. The transmission will be interrupted by the destruction of the aircraft, which would be triggered by a radio signal. Since also Flight American 77 disappeared from the radar screens before reappearing in the Pentagon area, could something similar have happened with the plane that hit the Pentagon as well? The American military elite seems to respond to the recurring need of waging wars of conquest, both to increase the control on worldwide resources and to maintain a healthy and productive war industry that is among the most profitable altogether. It only makes sense that also the tanks, the submarines, and the military planes that are produced every day must be put to use within a certain amount of time, just like any other industrial product we consume. This is a military planes graveyard located near Tucson, Arizona. Most of these machines are still in good shape, but they are put away and slowly dismantled as they become obsolete. President Eisenhower, himself a former general, was among the first ones to foresee the danger that a permanent military industry could represent for his country.
I get tired of saying that defense is to be made an excuse for wasting dollars. I don't believe we should pay 1 cent for defense more than we have to.
Before he left office in 1961, he gave a memorable speech that today appears as a lucid prophecy.
This conjunction of an immense military establishment and a large arms industry is new in the American experience. In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist. We must never let the weight of this combination endanger our liberties or democratic processes.
Eisenhower's prophecy, unfortunately, became true.
The rush of battle. The glory of victory. The birth of heroes. These are the movies that brought the front lines to the front row. Every Saturday night, the Military Channel brings you the films that went beyond the battlefield and showed you more like...
Fed by a culture of war, which has even created its own television channel called the Military Channel.
On the Military Channel.
The arms industry is enjoying one of the most productive and rewarding times thanks to the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. In the meantime, the Pentagon's budget has risen to over $400 billion per year. That's more than 4 times the amount that the neoconservatives ever dared to dream in the year 2000. To maintain the Bush administration war doctrine, massive increases in military spending have been required. The United States now spends more than $400 billion annually on the military, 7 times as much as the next biggest spender, and nearly equal to what the rest of the world spends combined. Obviously, the large corporations like Boeing, Lockheed, or Raytheon produce weapons not only for the United States, but also for the rest of the world.
It is an incredible thing that we arm the world and then turn around and come to Congress and say, look at all these weapons out there. They're almost superior to ours. They're comparable to ours. Well, of course they are. They're ours. We sold them to them.
It takes mobility to win the day. Our forces need to be fast and agile.
The Hellfire 2 missile system defeats advanced armor by semi-active laser guidance. And
such a system is Skyguard, a high-energy laser shield against short-range rockets.
Hellfire 2 is the weapon of choice on Apache, Super Cobra, SH-60, and HH-60 helicopters.
Part of the system delivering unprecedented levels of assured networked interconnectivity.
Airborne Laser is making impressive progress on its way to demonstrating the lethality of a megawatt-class directed energy weapon system. Skyguard is designed to stop the conventional man-pad.
Advanced EHF's phased arrays also deliver a new super agile, providing a 12-fold increase in cross-link data
In the
rate.
case of a ground-to-air attack, sensors detect the missile's launch and the fire unit slews to acquire. This technology has addressed the deadly Katyusha rocket, a weapon favored by terrorists. This is the muzzle of this powerful laser system to protect mobile forces as well as high-value assets. Multiple kills are readily handled, all at the speed of light, and providing force protection when and where it is needed.
Since the end of the Cold War, we've sold more military weapons than the rest of the world combined.
My name is Jack Shanahan, Vice Admiral, U.S. Navy, retired. One of our nuclear bombs blows up Hiroshima 15 times over. 5 devastates Russia. After that, this is how many the U.S. has left.
Another important element that contributes to the recurring need for America to extend its reach beyond the national borders is definitely oil. At the end of World War II, the U.S. found itself as the only country whose territory had not been damaged directly by the war. While Germany, Italy, and Japan, but also Russia, France, and England, began the slow path to reconstruction, the U.S. could launch straight into an era of development and industrial growth that would put them ahead of the world until the current times. Thus began the quest for the so-called American Dream, a dream made of wealth, comfort, and well-being that still plays a major role in modern American culture.
So we can have things with new beauty, longer life, and low maintenance costs. Improvements we can afford because they are economically produced, and that can be bought by more and more people for less money than they ever cost.
The concept of freedom, for which so many men had given their lives in the war against the Nazis, was slowly transformed and downsized to the concept of freedom of choice in personal shopping.
Also the basic freedom of the American people, which is the freedom of individual choice. Our abundance is big and comes from bigness. The bigness of our busy business. The bigness of our fields. The bigness of our fast-moving, modern America. Our bigness, our greatness, the abundance that stems from liberty, is based on free and thrifty use of the great American penny, the foundation of our wealth. Enough new pennies coming from our mints each month to supply copper for 3 new Statues of Liberty.
But industrial progress is directly linked to energy resources, and it was soon clear that America could never count on its oil alone to satisfy its ever-increasing energy demand. A large effort was made to reinforce in the population the idea that oil was something absolutely necessary before embarking in long-term risky investments in foreign countries.
Gasoline, for example, the most efficient mobile power source on Earth. That was the stuff that powered all those cars and trucks. And using the magic of research, oil companies compete with each other in taking the petroleum molecule apart and rearranging it into, well, you name it, fabrics, toothbrushes, tires, insecticides, cosmetics, weed killers, a whole galaxy of things to make a better life on Earth.
After weeks of discussions, there was a meeting at Qasem Palace on the outskirts of Jeddah. It was there that Saudi Arab government officials representing His Majesty signed a concession covering roughly 320,000 square miles. This was the starting point of a new American business venture abroad.
The popular image of the gold seeker was quickly replaced by that of the seeker of oil, which not by chance was also called the Black Gold.
Most important of all, the job would require men, hardy men, determined men, men who were willing to leave families and friends and journey halfway around the world on a quest that might end in failure. Men who could face hardship and monotony and still take it. And gradually they began to arrive. Carpenters, machinists, riggers, technicians, drillers, executives too, eager to extend a welcoming hand clasp to the new arrivals. Finally they drilled the first well. They found oil, but not in commercial quantities. It was not encouraging. They drilled again. No luck. And again, still failure. And then, at Dammam, it happened. Oil in commercial quantities had been brought in after 3 long, discouraging years. This was the goal toward which they had striven. This was the victory that faith and sweat had bought.
It was the birth of a new concept that would strongly influence American foreign policy from that time on, the so-called American interest abroad.
Serving the interest of the United States and demonstrating the vitality of the American system of free enterprise. A system which, from this new frontier, is pumping into the trade of the world oil. One of the materials that is making a truly great contribution to our modern civilization.
This is what the world map would look like if it were drawn according to each nation's energy resources. As one can see, the countries in the Persian Gulf would be larger than all the rest of the world together. The debate on how much oil is still left in the world is open and ranges from those who maintain that the peak of extraction has already been reached to those who believe that the shortage would not begin for many more years. In any case, the United States produces only 4% of the oil in the world, while it consumes about 26% of the total production.
What we have here is a stripper well that's producing from about 5,000 feet down, about a mile down. It's only producing 7 barrels per day, which is not very much. Most of the wells in this area produce about 7 barrels per day. This well once produced 100 barrels per day about 30 years ago. Since then, it's declined because it's only so much oil down in the ground, so we're producing it all, and it's running out of oil.
The need for foreign oil has been rising dramatically for the United States over the past 30 years. In 1973, the U.S. needed to import only 28% of its total consumption, while that figure today is nearing 60% and is projected to reach 70% by the year 2025. For this reason, In the recent past, Americans have also been looking at a different energy resource, natural gas. The majority of the reserves are located in the different states of Central Asia that once belonged to the Soviet Union, especially those around the Caspian Basin. In 1998, Dick Cheney, who was then the president of Halliburton, an oil and services company, commented, "I can't think of a time when we have had a region emerge as suddenly to become as strategically significant as the Caspian." The good Lord didn't see fit to put oil and gas only where there are democratically elected regimes friendly to the United States. Occasionally, we have to operate in places where, all things considered, one would not normally choose to go. But even more interesting is this document presented by a Unocal Oil Company official to a Senatorial Commission for Energy in the same year. It offers a totally different picture about the true interests of the United States in Afghanistan. The main issue was the need for multiple pipeline routes for Central Asian oil and gas. The Caspian region contains tremendous untapped hydrocarbon reserves. Proven natural gas reserves within Azerbaijan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, and Kazakhstan equal more than 236 trillion cubic feet. The region's total oil reserves may reach more than 60 billion barrels of oil. As one can see, the entire Caspian Basin has already been divided among the largest oil companies in the world. But there remains one problem, said the document: how to bring these huge amounts of resources to the countries that need it most, especially China and Japan. One option is to go east across China, but this would mean constructing a pipeline of more than 3,000 kilometers to central China, as well as a 2,000-kilometer connection to reach the main population centers along the coast. A second option is to build a pipeline south from Central Asia to the Indian Ocean. From there, the gas could be loaded onto ships bound for the east. One obvious potential route south would be across Iran. However, this option is foreclosed for American companies because of U.S. sanctions legislation. The only other possible route option is across Afghanistan, which has its own unique challenges. The territory across which the pipeline would extend is controlled by the Taliban, an Islamic movement that is not recognized as a government by most other nations. From the outset, we have made it clear that the construction of our proposed pipeline cannot begin until a recognized government is in place that has the confidence of governments, lenders, and our company. In the summer of 2001, the Unocal people made one last effort to find an agreement with the Taliban. But the meeting failed, ending with this ominous threat directed to the Taliban: either we will cover you with a carpet of gold, or we will bury you under a carpet of bombs. On September 10th, a detailed plan to attack Afghanistan was put on George Bush's desk for him to be signed upon his return from Florida. The following morning, the Twin Towers were turned into rubble. The United States immediately accused bin Laden, who at the time was in Afghanistan, and requested the Taliban to hand him over.
I want him held. I want justice. And there's an old poster out west, as I recall, that said "Wanted, dead or alive."
Bin Laden declared that he had nothing to do with the attacks. From Afghanistan, he said, it would have been impossible for him to organize such a complex and sophisticated operation. And a few days later he added, "There exists a government within the government of the United States. That secret government must be asked as to whom carried out these attacks. The U.S. should trace the perpetrators of those attacks to these persons who want to make the present century one of their own control, who want to enslave other countries." The Taliban responded that they would hand over the Saudi sheikh after the United States had shown the world the evidence that he was responsible for the attacks. But this never happened, and 3 weeks later, the United States attacked Afghanistan at the head of an international coalition. After removing the Taliban from power, a temporary government was put in place. It was headed by Hamid Karzai, an Afghan living in America who had previously worked as a consultant for Unocal. In the meantime, the world media spread the mythology of the rebel hidden in highly sophisticated self-powered caves with air conditioning and ammunition stacks. But in reality, bin Laden was nowhere to be found. Instead of increasing the pressure, 3 months later, President Bush shocked the world by suddenly announcing that bin Laden had become irrelevant.
And, you know, again, I don't know where he is. I repeat what I said. I truly am not that concerned about him.
In the meantime, the deal between Afghanistan, Turkmenistan, and Pakistan for the pipeline to the Indian Ocean had been signed, exactly at the conditions posed by Unocal 4 years before.
If you map the pipeline, proposed pipeline route across to Afghanistan, and you look at our bases, matches perfectly. Our bases are there to solve a problem that Taliban could not solve. Taliban couldn't provide security in that part of Afghanistan. Well, now that's where our bases are.
One of the ways that gives the oil companies tremendous clout is the recognition that their interests and the interests of the nation are pretty much the same. And of course, this is justified by claiming that since oil is now the basic energy resource, this is argued as basic national security.
As we know, the final goal for the neocons had always been Iraq, which had nothing to do with Islamic terrorism. For this reason, the Bush administration has needed to produce a major effort to propagate the idea that a connection between Saddam Hussein and the September 11 attacks in fact existed.
General Clark has said publicly that on 9/11, as American couples were holding hands and jumping to their death, the White House called him and said, "Pin it on Iraq." They weren't thinking about the Americans dying. They weren't thinking about the people who were committing suicide in order to escape the flames. They were thinking about 9/11 not as an attack, but as a gift.
The president dragged me into a room with a couple of other people, shut the door, and said, "I want you to find whether Iraq did this." That George Bush wanted me to come back with a report that said, Iraq did this.
Secretary of the Treasury Paul O'Neill decided to leave the administration when he became aware of their true intents in the Middle East.
That questions such as why Saddam and why now were never asked. It's all about finding a way to do it. That was the tone of it. The president saying, "Go find me a way to do this."
In the very beginning, there was a conviction that Saddam Hussein was a bad person and that he needed to go.
He says that going after Saddam Hussein was topic A 10 days after the inauguration, 8 months before September 11th.
The problem for the Bush administration is that plans that already existed for regime change in Iraq had to be justified. They couldn't just go in without public support. The public support was created by connecting Saddam Hussein to those fears of terrorism. The fear generated by 9/11, the fear of terrorist networks, has to be transferred to Iraq. That is, the American people have to learn to be as afraid of Saddam Hussein as they are of Osama bin Laden.
If they'd come to the American people and said, look, we want to engage in a war of conquest, in effect, to reestablish the balance politically in the Middle East, I don't think people would have gone along with it.
The president basically has let the public believe a lie, which is that Iraq played a role in 9/11, which is nonsense.
I've never believed that from the very beginning. Why would Saddam Hussein risk being involved with al-Qaeda? He has no record of trusting terrorist groups.
Here's this guy, I was on TV with him. He said this in public. That bastard Saddam Hussein was responsible for September 11th. When he knew very well that there was no basis for this story,
Saddam Hussein. Saddam Hussein.
Saddam Hussein.
Saddam Hussein. Saddam Hussein. Saddam 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 Hussein. Iraq continues to flaunt its hostility toward America and to support terror. The Iraqi regime has plotted to develop anthrax and nerve gas and nuclear weapons for over a decade. This is a regime that has something to hide from the civilized world.
His regime has the design for a nuclear weapon, was working on
in terms of the actual weapons that they've been producing. They've been busy in terms of expanding.
Recently was discovered seeking significant quantities of uranium from Africa.
Institutional capability to produce additional weapons.
Iraq has weapons of mass destruction.
Busy in terms of expanding their capability.
They have weapons of mass destruction. Any country on the face
of those weapons, year after year after year,
knows that Iraq has weapons of mass destruction.
A purpose, that they're purposeful about what they're doing.
C'est ça qui est inquiétant, de voir avec quelle facilité.
The disturbing thing is to see how well-organized and repetitive propaganda, driving the point home into people's minds, can be so effective.
We cannot wait for the final proof, the smoking gun, that could come in the form of a mushroom cloud.
How much longer are we willing to put up with Iraq's non-compliance before we, as a council, we as the United Nations say, enough?
Come out! Open the door! Open the door! Get your hands up and come outside! Come outside! Everybody in the house needs to come outside!
From the beginning, it was clear that the Iraqi invasion would be about anything but bringing a true democracy in that country.
We just pulled out here yesterday just to come out and help protect the oil line.
In a tank?
In a tank.
Prize thief among the high Nazis was Hermann Goering, who looted museums and private...
At the end of World War II, the American soldiers recovered from the residence of Hermann Goering a vast collection of art pieces the Nazi leader had been removing from the museums of the conquered cities.
Not content with robbing people of their freedom and their lives, the Nazis tried to make off with their symbols of culture.
In 2003, it was the Iraqis who showed the world the remnants of their immense artistic heritage, which had been destroyed or stolen by the Americans. At a time when humanitarian groups were not allowed in the destroyed cities yet, it appears that art dealers and merchants with a close relationship to the Pentagon had free access to and from the country. The most precious and rare artifacts dating back to the Sumerian civilization were either destroyed or stolen. Entire libraries from all branches of knowledge were emptied in a matter of days.
Coming to steal the most precious books we have here. They are specialists. They know the value of these books.
And whatever was not stolen was burnt and turned to ashes by special chemical components. It was as if someone wanted to prevent a future rebirth of the nation by depriving the new generations from their country's immense cultural heritage. Some of the most famous archaeological sites were also destroyed with no apparent reason. In the meantime, the Bush administration convinced Congress to approve the extraordinary printing of $20 billion in cash to be used for the reconstruction of Iraq.
We will help them to restore basic services, such as electricity and water, and to build new schools, roads, and medical clinics.
360 tons of $100 bills were physically transported to Iraq in single packages worth a few $1 million each. As soon as they arrived, the packages were stacked in the basement of Saddam's former residence. The money was officially under the responsibility of the international coalition, but it was in fact the Pentagon that handled and controlled it in the person of the so-called American proconsul, Paul Bremer. As soon as Bremer took charge of Baghdad, he declared Iraq a territory where the Iraqi law was no longer valid, but he didn't put it under the American law either. This created a vacuum of power in which the only law became the law of survival.
So American law was suspended, Iraqi law was suspended, and Iraq basically became a free fraud zone. In a free fraud zone, you can steal anything you like. And that was what they did.
Any American company that came up with a project was immediately financed, with no questions asked, and sometimes even without signing a receipt.
$2 million was due on the 1st of August. We went down to the vault, got the $2 million in crisp new $100 bills. They were shrink-wrapped in $100,000 amounts. We called the representative of Custer Battles and said, come on up and get your payment, bring a gunny sack. We've got your money ready for you.
Yet the only companies allowed to participate in the no-bid contracts were Halliburton and its subsidiaries, which ended up getting the entire share of the pie.
When the vice president is your former CEO, you're going to get the access that other people don't.
But this isn't all. All the money literally disappeared in a couple of months, without a single school, hospital, or bridge ever being built. This generated a monstrous paradox in which the same people who had just been destroying the country, the Vice President and the Secretary of Defense, were now managing and assigning the money for the reconstruction.
It is reportedly not a coincidence that Vice President Dick Cheney's old company got a huge contract to help rebuild Iraq. Time magazine said it has gotten a hold of a Pentagon email saying Cheney's office coordinated Halliburton's multi-billion-dollar deal.
The contract with Halliburton was based on the so-called cost-plus formula, in which the company is reimbursed for all expenses incurred, and on top receives a profit that is proportional to such expenses.
The cost-plus arrangement, the critics say, leaves little incentive to save. The more taxpayer dollars Halliburton spends, the more Halliburton makes.
The place that they chose for orientation in Kuwait was a huge resort set right on the ocean. Had, I think, 3 swimming pools.
Marble floors, mahogany woodwork. It's just beautiful. You could go and rent wave runners and go out and play in the water.
I was told this, don't question it, enjoy it.
It was so lavish. Rows of vegetable platters, beef platters, fish platter.
We had it made over there compared to the military. I mean, those guys were living in tents, and we had air-conditioned private hooches.
The soldiers are sleeping on these little cots out in the middle of the desert, while these KBR executives are driving these $40,000 vehicles.
This secretary lives in this complex, eats her meals in this complex, has her laundry delivered to her, has no reason to go anywhere at any time, but has a brand new top-of-the-line Ford or Chevy pickup with everything imaginable on it that you could put on it.
Chrome rims and leather interior and CD players and all these extra amenities that, you don't really need in wartime.
Why do they need an H-2 Hummer? Why do they have Cadillac Escalades in Iraq for Halliburton managers? What is the purpose?
Cost Plus encourages you to run up the cost of a program because you are going to get a percentage of the end result.
Halliburton stock has quadrupled in value since the war began, and taxpayers are being ripped off.
In order to truly inflate the costs, however, sleeping in luxury hotels is not enough. You have to waste, destroy, throw away everything possible to then reorder everything anew.
They got the wrong equipment, ordered the wrong stuff, computers still in boxes, new vehicles. They'd push them out in what they called burn pits. And they just set it on fire, claim it as a loss, get more money for the right equipment or the right stuff they needed.
You got brand new trucks over there, and there's not even oil filters. So when the motor blows, what do? Buy a new truck and build the government.
$75,000 truck. They wouldn't even have a spare tire to fit it. And we had to blow it up. And they didn't care Halliburton did because the government's paying for it.
We knew that every day that a vehicle broke down, we would have to destroy it. And these are maybe $80,000 vehicles, maybe $100,000. You know, they're expensive trucks. We're burning fuel in front of Iraqi people. We're not really doing anything to help, and we just have to follow the orders.
As a truck driver in the mail department, they'd send me to these camps with one bag of mail. That's risking my life just to deliver one bag of mail.
Halliburton's charging the government for every camp they go by. And your buddy's getting killed for no cause at all. Not even as much as a Band-Aid on the truck. That's how Halliburton was making the killing and making their money.
Halliburton was hired to provide clean, safe cooking, cleaning, shower water for the military. One of Halliburton's employees saw something wiggling in the water in his toilet bowl. So I went and tested the water in our water storage tanks. There was no chlorine in them, none. The water we showered in every single day was extremely contaminated. And when I talk about contaminated water, I'm saying malaria, typhus, giardia, cryptosporidium. I mean, the list is really, really long. They were only concerned with making their profit and didn't care how it may affect the troops. Of the 67 water treatment plants that Halliburton run, 63 of them weren't providing safe water. And the Marines are showering in it every single day.
In the meantime, the Pentagon had registered the disappearance of over $2 trillion in one fiscal year alone.
When DOD's own auditors say the department cannot account for $2.3 trillion in transactions in 1 year alone.
It is,
it's a terrible record, and it's preposterous that the Defense Department doesn't know what's happened to this money.
Oil companies have also had immense benefit from the crisis caused by the war.
ExxonMobil just reported earnings for the third quarter, and here it is, $10.5 billion, $10.5 billion of profits in 3 months. And get this, Tony, it's the second most profitable quarter ever for an American corporation. Guess number one was? Number one was ExxonMobil in the fourth quarter of last year, where they earned $10.7 billion.
The more oil companies gain, the more they can finance an administration that has clearly been acting according to their own interests. This all translates in an ever-increasing cost for the taxpayer, who has to shoulder the entire cost of the war in the Middle East. Before 2001, a full tank of gasoline would cost about $20. The same fill-up today costs over $50. For the military industry, the private companies, and the oil companies, the consequences of September 11 have turned into a bonanza of profits that has become difficult to translate into actual numbers.
They were thinking about 9/11 not as an attack, but as a gift.
In the meantime, tens of thousands of mercenaries have reached Iraq from all over the world, perfectly organized by specific companies, but paid for by the American taxpayer. They have found in Iraq the ideal ground to express their vocation. This is a group of mercenaries from Aegis, a British security company, having fun while shooting people in the streets around Baghdad. Also, regular soldiers often showed a very peculiar interpretation of the rules of engagement.
All right, I don't want to hear it.
In this case, the time between the warning shot and the actual shooting is no more than 3 seconds. Most likely the driver, who had the sun in his eyes, didn't even realize that soldiers were shooting at him. The most shameful moment came with the publication of a series of photographs depicting American soldiers inflicting all kinds of tortures on Iraqi prisoners. The so-called Abu Ghraib scandal shook the world. But the Pentagon maintained that it was a problem limited to a few bad apples.
Our Army values of loyalty, duty, respect, selfless service, honor, integrity, and personal courage are taught to our soldiers from the moment that they enter the training base. There's no question that potential consequences are serious, but we must not forget that these are a few among a great many others who are serving with great honor and sacrifice.
Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld has been thoroughly interrogated by Senator McCain, himself a prisoner of war for 5 years in Vietnam.
What agencies or private contractors were in charge of interrogations? Did they have authority over the guards? And what were their instructions to the guards?
The military intelligence people, as General Smith has indicated, were the people who were in charge of the interrogation part of the process.
What were the instructions to the guards?
That is what the investigation that I've indicated has been undertaken.
But Mr. Secretary, that's a very simple, straightforward question.
Well, as Chief of Staff of the Army can tell you, the guards are trained to guard people. They're not trained to interrogate. They're not, and their instructions are to, in the case of Iraq, adhere to the Geneva Convention.
The suspicion instead is that this was an intentional violation of the Geneva Convention, based on the use of brutal force meant to show the world who was the new master to whom everyone else should pay obedience from now on.
Turn your head! Turn your head! Yes. Stay.
Many former military have denounced a widespread philosophy based on ethnic and racial superiority principles.
Race plays a larger role than most people would believe or would want to believe. There's this idea that Arabs and Muslims are against the United States, and therefore they're one monolithic entity that are our enemies. I think that's a huge motivation for people on the ground to commit these kind of offenses.
Pulitzer Prize winner Seymour Hersh, who had denounced to the world the horrors of My Lai, later found that the torture techniques used in Iraq had been approved directly by Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld. A secret document named Copper Green described and encouraged techniques of physical restraint and sexual humiliation for the prisoners. The document suggested in particular the use of the fear of dogs, removal of garments, and forcing the prisoners for long periods of time in stressing positions.
Oh yes, oh yes, you're gonna get it. Yes, naughty little boys.
These are American soldiers filming the beating of Iraqi citizens by a group of English soldiers.
Yes. 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 Oh, please, don't hurt me. Shoot it out! You're gonna die. Oh.
It was, in fact, a true philosophy, intended to pervade every level of the army, from the lowest to the highest. A philosophy that had nothing to do with the installation of democracy, but betrayed instead the same principles of superiority and desire for domination that had been outlined in the Project for the New American Century, signed by the neocons. This is what Michael Ledeen, a leading neoconservative, wrote in one of his books. Creative destruction is our middle name, both within our own society and abroad. We tear down the old order every day, from business to science, literature, art, architecture, and cinema, to politics and the law. Our enemies have always hated this whirlwind of energy and creativity, which menaces their traditions, whatever they may be, and challenges them for their inability to keep pace. Seeing America undo traditional societies, they fear us, for they do not wish to be undone. They must attack us in order to survive, just as we must destroy them to advance our historic mission. In the meantime, the number of soldiers who have died in Iraq has surpassed 3,000, more than the number of the victims of September 11. Enlisted among the most needy and desperate, they are deluded with false promises of career and adventures. Before they go to the front, they undergo a thorough process of brainwashing, meant to transform them into simple machines, capable only of killing.
You don't give a fuck, and somebody's gonna get fucking killed. You understand me? I will fucking go spastic on every fucking single one of you. You better fucking wake up. You better get some fucking intensity. You better fucking realize what the fuck is going on. It's a serious fucking business. We got 2 more fucking weeks here, and I'm not in the mood for somebody who doesn't give a fuck. You understand? Yeah. Do you fucking understand, kid? I swear to God. Do you understand? Yeah. Do you understand? Garcia, you better wake the fuck up. Do you understand? Yeah. McBride, do you fucking understand? Yeah. Let's clean our fucking weapons, get in the fucking vehicles, and ready to fucking go.
God damn. Sucks to be your ass, you fucking mooge motherfucker. Woo-hoo! What mosque? You're fucking going. Hey, what is it or what? Dude, look at we fucked those people all the shit down there.
Dude, those 2 people?
You see who pulled up in the white car? I shot that dude in the white car, ran into the fucking building.
The end is near, and all these people, they will learn to stop worshiping Allah and start worshiping the 2,000-pound JDM that's about to fuck their whole world up.
Did you see that? That is fucking sweet!
Seen from the sky, life and death become like elements of a video game, played by people no longer capable of realizing they are dealing with the lives of other human beings.
Range auto. Alright, got auto range on it. Roger. Yeah, Roger. Engaging. Got him. right, see if anyone's moved by the truck. Go ahead and store that, auto range store. There's another guy underneath, move right there. Go ahead, firing, hit him. Target 4. We're going to take the other truck out. Roger. Wait for move by the truck. Movement right there. Roger, he's wounded. Hit him. Hit the truck. Hit the truck in him. Go forward of it and hit him. Roger.
I got numerous individuals on the road. You want me to take those out? Take them out. 10 seconds. Roger. Impact.
More than 1 million Iraqi civilians have been killed in the first 5 years of war. Entire towns have been erased from the map. Before the war, Fallujah counted more than 350,000 people. Today it is a land of ruins that is being covered with cement to contain the devastating effects of radioactivity caused by the use of depleted uranium. More than 4 million Iraqis have been displaced, and they won't be able to return home simply because their homes no longer exist. Industries are gone, infrastructures are devastated, schools, shops, museums, and gardens are but a distant memory. After the $20 billion in cash meant for the reconstruction was stolen, children don't even have enough water to drink.
لا تنكري وجهي فأنت حبيبتي وورود مائي وكأس شرابي لا تنكري وجهي فأنت حبيبتي وورود مائدتي وكأس شرابي بغداد جئتك كالسفينة متعبة أخفي جراحاتي وراء ثيابي بغداد منذ طفولتي شمسان نايمتان في أهدابي لا تنكري وجهي فأنت حبيبتي وورود مائدتي وكأس شرابي لا تنكري وجهي فأنت حبيبتي وورود مائدتي وكأس شرابي